The aim of human life and the human experience is for us to realize that unity, to realize that my consciousness, my awareness is identical to the universal creative consciousness. One and the same. The only difference is that we forget that. We identify with our persona ego and lose our connection to that divine consciousness.
Hello, welcome back to Soul Sessions with Creative Mind. I'm Deborah Burnt Maldonado. I'm here with Dr. Rob Maldonado, my partner in crime, and we are continuing our series on key concepts of Jungian psychology. And I just want to remind you before we begin and dive deep into the father archetype, I would love for you to subscribe to our channel if you're watching us here on YouTube, because you want to go back to the rest of the series and continue with the series with future shows.
Yeah, I'd like to just a shout out to our team.
Yeah,
we put them through hell with
with
all our crazy ideas.
Oh no, I'm sure they love it.
Yeah, we love you guys. Thank you.
Yeah, this is the first time you're listening to us. We're just going to identify some descriptions, the archetype, and a little review of the mother archetype before we get into father. So, what is an archetype?
It's often quoted but often misunderstood concept. And it is hard to understand. It's probably of all Jung's work, the archetype or the concept of the archetype is right up there with the collective unconscious. And they go together. It's essentially, if you think of the collective unconscious as the reservoir of human history, all human beings have contributed to the collection of these images and archetypes that are in the collective unconscious. The archetypes are essentially patterns of behavior, of thought, of experience that are in the collective unconscious that then the individual draws from through myths, through dreams, through patterns of existence.
And so another way to think about it is our universal kind of collective experience of being human. For example, all of us have an experience of mother, father, children, birth, marriage, religion, God. So we have these universal ideas that have been, in the human history and a part of our human nature that our personal history is basically shaped by. So we didn't invent being a mother in our lifetime. We didn't invent being a father. We didn't invent God in our lifetime. We, over thousands and thousands of years, humanity has this history, and it's almost like constellations of organizational structures that we rely upon on a deeper level. It's like almost like this universal intelligence that binds us together and kind of a template or an unconscious blueprint of being a human being.
Yeah, and the definition sounds like they're very abstract and remote from our human everyday existence, but it couldn't be furthest from the truth. In actuality, Jung says the archetypes are they construct the matrix of our reality. In other words, what you're seeing when you see the world, you're seeing the archetypes in action. The patterns, the structure that we see in the world is a reflection of the inner structure of our psyche, which are made out of archetypes.
And they're more than just characters, like a mother, father, but also processes. So like the hero's journey, many of you have studied Jung or Joseph Campbell, heard of the hero's journey. It's a process. Birth is a process. Marriage, like these very conceptual ideas that we take for granted. War is an archetype. So we're looking at this world in this template that just kind of we replace it with new characters. And if you look at a movie, there's actually archetypal structure to every movie. There's, the hero, and there's the victim, and then there's the villain, and there's a process of transformation that the hero goes through. That is an archetype as well. So it's much more than just, I'm mother, father. It's a lot deeper. And if you think about everything in life, there's this commonality that we share as human beings and our human nature. And if we could tap into that, can you imagine the troubles of the world? We find unity with each other because we're all kind of come from this well of wisdom and knowledge from, ancient antiquity, forming who we are today.
Yeah, so in reviewing the mother archetype, we think about matter, and actually the words are connected. Matter comes from or is related to the word mother. And we are made out of matter, right? The universe is a material expression.
The body is matter?
That's right. And so when we talk about matter, we're talking about the mother archetype. So instinctually, we think Mother Earth. What sustains us, what gives sustenance to our body, and what creates our body. In yoga philosophy, right, the Annamaya Kosha, which is the outer expression of the body, is made out of food, meaning it's made out of the elements that we take from the world, consume them, and reconstruct our body from within.
I think we'd be healthier if we knew that our bodies were made out of food versus food just gives us energy. Like think of it as more of an energy system that we actually, this is food that we're seeing in ourselves. So then the father archetype is, if we're matter, that we see and the material world, the father would be the opposite, the unseen.
Yeah. And here we ask people to put away the gender issues. We're not talking about gender here. These are, again, mythological, archetypal symbols that Jung is using to talk about these deeper structures of the psyche. So we can flip them around if we want and say matter is the father and spirit is the mother. It leads to the same place. So, but in the typical mythology that we see in the world in different cultures, the father then is the archetype of spirit, the Father God that moves the world, that creates the world often through its movement. So everyone is, or most people are familiar with the Judeo-Christian God archetype, which is Yahweh or Jehovah sometimes called. He's the creator God. He creates and brings the universe into existence.
But we can't see him directly. It's always like this unseen part. And we try to depict it, the image of God in images, such as Michelangelo, who did the Sistine Chapel, and God and Adam connecting. The old man in a beard kind of symbol of this father that we can't see.
Yeah, and so when we talk about the father archetype, just like with the mother, we can talk about our personal experience with our fathers as a starting point for our personal conceptualization of God, of the divine spirit. In our work, what we see is that if you do not do your personal exploration, examination of your past history with your parents, right, with the mother and the father,
all the projections that you placed on them with regard to these archetypes. So when we talked about the mother, she's like this ordinary human being, and we project the mother archetype on her, this like divine person that she could never live up to. So we're always disappointed that our mother didn't meet all our expectations. And then we do the same thing with the father.
Yeah, so when people don't do that examination, then they carry those personal elements of the personal unconscious, as Jung would say, into the collective unconscious, or they project their personal narrative of father and mother onto these archetypal structures. And that is a mistake, because what you're seeing then is your own narrative instead of the universal archetypal structure. And your relationship is tainted by your personal history instead of creating and relating to these archetypal structures in a more creative way.
So, for example, you're saying that when we project that father archetype on the father, and then we say we're raised in whatever religion we're raised in or concept of God we're raised in, we tend to project that relationship onto the divine image. So my father was very strict, and you had to follow the rules, and there was no room for failure. And so when I thought of God, I was in, of course, a lot of Catholics can relate, maybe Jews too, that kind of like punishing father, that you have to follow the rules, or you sin, you're going to be punished, and you're going to be sent to hell. Or, well, I know Jews don't believe in hell, but in Catholic, it's like you are going to hell if you break the law. And that's kind of my projection of my relationship with God. So I was always so fearful, like in my early life, of not, wanting to serve him and making sure I obey, which led me to be like the good do-gooder, and always trying to and then beat myself up if I failed in any way, like going to confession and having to confess my sins and all those things. So we end up thinking that God is not a friendly God. He's like, you got to follow the rules, and then if you do everything right, you go to heaven, you get the reward. So yeah, that's like an example of that, right?
Yeah, what you're describing is the personal and the cultural aspects of the individual. And these personal and cultural aspects, of course, they're part of our everyday lives. And they seem natural to us that of course we would interpret and see the world through this lens. But Jung is talking about a much different way of experiencing the archetype, especially the father God archetype. He's saying, if you do not individuate, if you do not transcend your ego, meaning your identity with your persona and your body, you as a cultural being, if you're not able to transcend that, you're simply playing out your own personal assumptions about what God is and what the universe is based on your personal experience.
So you don't have really a true, pure relationship with God. You have a projected relationship, and it's kind of distorted by your own relationship with your father and those assumptions. And it's not something you choose, like conscious. It's not something that you're conscious of. You you don't even notice that there is a similar projection until you examine it.
Yeah, that's why I remember talking about some of these things with friends, and they would literally like back away when I mentioned the word God, because they're projecting their own personal experiences with their fathers unto that image of the Father God, right? The Spirit God. And of course, if you reject and it is kind of your duty to reject your father's point of view, their worldview, because you're meant as a child to bring something new into the world. And so your task is in part is to reject that old world. And so they reject everything that has to do with God and spirit and all that, all the mythology, all the rich mythology and culture that comes with that, because of that personal interpretation.
Now, can I ask you a question? What about same-sex parents? Because there's a lot of people that are gay and they adopt. Is it there's one person that takes on that more fatherly role and the other person takes on more the motherly role in that dynamic? Or is it a mixture? Because like you said, this has nothing to do with your sexual orientation or gender. It's more an idea.
Yeah, I think all of those are possible ways of being a family. You know, every family has its own dynamics.
There's some families where straight families, the mother's really the authoritarian, and the man plays more of the feminine role. It could be that as well, like examining that. So that's why I wanted to just say, get out of your head that it's just male and female, but more authority, I guess, in the family and who's in charge and who's more,
Yeah, well, let's say that this conversation so far, we're really talking about the cultural, religious structures of how these archetypes play out in human society. The deeper layers, which is what Jung's psychology is able to do, it's able to take us much deeper than that. Like, what is deeper than these gender roles and these cultural norms? You're talking about yin yang, you're talking about spirit and matter, questions of mysticism, questions of transcendence, like mystical experiences that go way beyond kind of our identification as individual human beings. That's a very different layer of the work that only Jung psychology really goes that deep.
Yeah, that's true. So what else about the God archetype is important?
So Jung wrote this remarkable book. I read it every few years just to remind myself of how deep and rich his work is. It's called Answer to Job. And Job, of course, is a book in the Old Testament, the Bible. So Job's story, it goes something like this, just briefly, and I'm paraphrasing essentially. So Job was considered an ideal kind of servant of God, right? He's righteous. He follows the rules, sacrifices, and devotes his life to God. So he's prosperous. He has many children, homes, wealth, great business, great friends, great family, which we all aspire to those things. One day, kind of God is pleased with his servant, Job, but the devil comes to court, kind of to God's throne, and says, "Oh yeah, Job is a great servant, and you see him as a great model for human beings, but he's in service of you and adores you or worships you because you're giving him everything, because he has a good life, essentially." take away his good life, his health, his family, his money, his success.
And then see how much he loves you. Right?
Yeah, and see what happens.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a temptation, kind of a bet, kind of a daring, if you really think he is devoted to you, test him. And so God tests him, right? He takes away his family, his children die, takes away his homes, they burn down, or something happens. He takes away his health. He starts to develop sores all over his body and is sick and ill. And then his friends start to criticize him, right? They're saying, you must have done something terrible to
You must have gotten God
deserve
mad,
this.
right?
Yeah. And so everything is falling apart around him, of course. And in the book, he starts to have this conversation with God, Yahweh, that is essentially challenging God as to his position and his relationship with his creature. In other words, Job is the creation of God, and God is the creator. Therefore, Job is essentially pleading his case and saying, well, if you created me...
Like, why are you making me suffer?
Yes,
type of thing?
Yeah, that kind of thing. And so that's kind of the beginning of Jung's examination of the book of Job and his answer to that, or in other words, his interpretation of what is happening here in this relationship of a human being as creature, as created creature, to the creator being, to this spirit God.
What does Jung ultimately say? I mean, it sounds like the dark night of the soul, where, we...
Yeah.
Like, and it's like unconditional love for the deity or the divine within ourselves, like not loving them just when things are going well, or thinking when things go well, then you're being, blessed.
Yeah. Well, if we fall back on our definition of these archetypes, right, that he's not talking about something external to us, right? Jung is talking about an internal God archetype that is part of our psyche.
Like the part of us that we relate to that's beyond the personal, that there's some kind of, most people believe there's some kind of higher power or something like that. And our relationship to it.
Right. So right away, we're taking a psychological point of view, a depth psychology point of view, not just kind of the ego perspective of things, but that there are deeper layers of the psyche that touch upon not only the personal unconscious, but the collective unconscious. So that's Jung's perspective on the book. So now we can kind of see what is the book of Job talking about in relationship to our human existence, that we're happy when things go our way, but as soon as things don't go our way, which is inevitable, we curse our fate, or we rebel against life, or we feel that life...
Like God abandoned you, right?
That's right.
Even Jesus said that the night before he was crucified. He said, why, or on the cross, he said, why have you forsaken me? One thing I took out of that book of Job, answer to Job, was that there was one phrase he said, that everything I feared has come upon me. And this idea that we always talk about your thoughts create your life, it's his fear that created those circumstances, not the devil and not God, but his own fear. And that he was projecting onto God that God is punishing him versus taking responsibility for his own mind and his own fear, like working with his own fears. And how can I have a deeper understanding of this, like, power within me, or this a God archetype, higher power, or higher self, or true self, or whatever that is that we talk about? How can we not blame this kind of fate on this other thing besides our own consciousness, and being responsible for our thinking, and being responsible for our own personal growth, and being responsible for our default ego desires, and examining that a little more. What do you think about that?
Yeah. The book that Jung wrote, the answer to Job, in other words, his interpretation of that experience, he's talking about how our relationship with the father archetype, this God within, as he sometimes calls it, which in Eastern philosophy is the self, the true self. He sees that there's an evolution going on here. That moral questioning of what is the purpose of suffering, right? Because that's what Job is about. It's human suffering at its kind of stark nakedness, right? That yes, we create all these things, great families and homes and successes, yet it all vanishes or is all subject to be taken away by life, by time, right? That in that questioning of going inward and examining what is my relationship to the creator element in me, the divine, the self, he sees that there's an evolution happening that is portrayed in the book, not only of the human being, in other words, the human being, the ego, the persona that Job is forced to examine his life from within and then ask the question of what is my relationship to this divine element that is the creator or the creative element within me, but also that the divine element is forced then to respond to this creature that is
like it's not a one-way
creation.
Communication, it's two-way, right?
That's right.
It's a relationship.
Yes.
A two-way relationship.
And that in a sense the creator God is individuating. It's being transformed itself through that relationship.
So our archetype, God archetype, and a father archetype transforms as we bring consciousness to it just as much because we're changing our personal projection onto it.
Yeah, it goes back to this idea. When he was in Africa, when Jung was in Africa, he saw the unconscious animals by the hundreds of thousands grazing on the savannas, but they were unconscious, right? Their heads were bobbing up and down, kind of eating grass and
kind of surviving, right?
Just being.
Being.
And he realized the position that human beings have in the creation, that we are conscious in a different way than animals, that we are self-aware in a way that most animals are not, and that was his vision of what is the need for human beings in the creation. It's that we represent both the animal nature, but also the divine self-awareness. And so we're the bridge between the animal nature of the world and the unconscious nature of the world and the divine awareness, right? That allows then the creator to experience its own creation.
Well, if you think about it, none of the animals keep records of their history, or, maybe they pass down tendencies and for survival and adaptation through evolution. But the human beings, I mean, we're recording our history. We're recording, what we've done. We have like this capacity to remember and look back and look forward. And it's like a higher level of experience. So it's almost like witnessing the experience of being alive in this kind of thing we call the world, and to record it in a way. And just like we do with our lives, we remember, more than an animal does. I mean, I think more domestic animals, they're more like us because they have adapted to being in a human family and become part of that. But for the most part, just kind of like, let's pass down this family story, or let's remember, where we came from and our ancestry, all these things, and history of our countries. And we have all that. And then science and sharing information and kind of discovering more and unveiling more, just more profound.
Yeah, if you remember the myth in the book, right, of where the book of Job is taking place, the original myth was that knowledge that we gain got us kicked out of the garden because we didn't fit into nature anymore in the typical way that animals do. We were outcasts now because we gained this self-awareness, and self-awareness, it doesn't allow us to live unconsciously.
And in this kind of like unified, balanced state that animals live in. And the only reason many of them are suffering right now is because human intervention, not because if the humans left the earth, the world would just be in balance, So there's this kind of, we're shut out from that garden of perfection and perfect balance because we have self-consciousness, self-awareness.
That's right.
Yeah.
So this back and forth, this two-way street, right? Like you say, it is essential in the universal construct. Now, Eastern philosophy helps us understand this a little bit better. In Eastern philosophy, the Atman, the individual soul, is identical to the Brahman, which is the universal God element, essentially. So God would be Brahman in the Vedic non-dual system or philosophy. And the Atman, the individual soul, the individual awareness, is identical to that. In other words, the aim of human life and the human experience is for us to realize that unity, to realize that my consciousness, my awareness is identical to the universal creative consciousness. One and the same. They're not different. The only difference is that we forget that. We identify with our persona ego and lose our connection to that divine consciousness.
And then we create religions that make it like it's far away from us. It's outside of us. And like in my book, Like a Spark from Fire, I read Adi Shankara said, we're like a spark from fire. We're the same substance. We're just different in name and form and awareness, basically. But we can have the same awareness. I don't know if we can have the totality of awareness that the pure divine has of space and time and mathematics and, you know, all those time ideas, but we can have access to that deeper wisdom in our lifetime. We can examine ourselves and go and connect and have a different relationship to this God image that may be different than we had when we were children or when we were in religious backgrounds. One thing I do know that there's so many people that we've worked with over the years that didn't have any religion growing up. So they had no relationship with a God image. And so as adults, they have to cultivate it. And it's there. It's not that it's not there. It's just how do we cultivate that image?
Yeah. In myths, then we see this power that the story, the myth, but we have to read it in its original intention, that it wasn't intended to represent a literal history of something that happened. It's talking in metaphor, in symbolic language, as we say in dream work.
And you see this in Greek myths too. Hercules being half god, half human, you know, that comes down to earth. Achilles had the same thing. There were so many myths of they forgot who they were and they were an ordinary person and someone had to remind them that they were a descendant of God. You know, there is so many of those myths are mirroring that idea.
Yeah, and so this myth that is portrayed in the story of Job is essentially speaking about this unity of the individual, the creature that we are as individual with this Atman or this individual soul, but that the soul is identical to the creative principle, consciousness, pure awareness, and therefore it's always talking about how do we realize that. Because if we get lost in this idea that, the material world is going to support me and give me enough to be happy and to kind of form my identity.
The security you get from a partner, from a steady job, from having a family that loves you, having a house, a shelter.
Yeah. And so it's a story, a narrative, a myth that is giving us a way to understand what is our relationship with those things, which is essentially a temporary, impermanent relationship, as a way of letting go of it, right? Not of rejecting it. In other words, it doesn't mean we should reject money or success or family, but as a way of understanding its position in the structure of creation. And then what is our relationship to this divine God, Father God principle?
For example, you can have like success from the place of that divine self, or you can have success from the ego. You can have a family based on ego, or you can have a family based on like more of your true pure self that wants to connect and wants the other partner to be happy, wants your children to flourish and grow versus I need them to be A students and I need to impress my neighbors and all those things that we fall into. And it's not bad. It's just we get caught up in the social structures of building a life and we think those things are so important that we forget our own divine nature.
One last thing to note about Jung's answer to Job is that he very elegantly incorporates this idea that Yahweh, God, the divine creative principle, is both light and dark.
Very important, yeah.
Yes, because if you think about the kind of how we perceive it from our individual perspective, we want good, we want light, we always want to live in happiness and joy, of course. But that's not reality. Reality, again, is that sickness, aging, and death essentially are part of our experience. And if we ignore that, if we split it into that kind of false duality, it is the nature of suffering. It is what causes our human suffering. Then we interpret anything that doesn't fit that goodness and light model as evil, as bad. But it's not that it's bad. It's simply that
you want to run away from it so quickly.
Or you want to curse
or
your own
cover it up.
creation.
Yeah.
Or your creator, right? And reject that, like Job's friends did. And so it's a great lesson in human suffering, in moral understanding, and then in spiritual integration. Like, what does this mean about my individuality in the context of this universal consciousness?
Very well said. Wow, what a packed episode this was. We hope you enjoyed it. And before you go, if you're listening to us on Spotify, iTunes, or any of the podcast services, don't forget to subscribe. We have another great episode coming next week. And so thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you soon.